So let's go ahead and grab a plate, and then we'll sit down and we'll just kind of get underway.
You got your.
It's
Really? That looks fun.
It actually is.
next week is going to be bad, but
I did,
then,
and-
you know, actually the last
was
couple of
talking about
days
early.
are okay.
Okay.
It's next
We were
week
talking
that
about that.
I'm
And I have
already double booked for many hours.
Just appointments and students.
Appointments and meeting with
If I don't
TAs
need it,
and
I
honors
get it.
theses and finishing up the experiments.
So it's like,
So
wow.
How many classes are you teaching?
I'm just teaching two big ones though. I have about 300 students. So that's a lot of office hours.
That's a lot of hours.
Yeah.
Do you have
I know my daughter was, she was a
I
teacher.
do. I have a bunch of TAs and they're big help. They're great TAs.
Involved in the lives as like
I
the
think that
surgeon.
could.
Yeah.
I
have 200
only had 20
classes.
classes, so I've never heard of it.
I have 212, I believe, and 106 or something. Yeah.
What's your research? Are you? No, I'm just, but you still do research during the
Yeah. So we're working on self-control.
I guess that's what we
I
have.
remember your husband presented on that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah. So the work I'm doing right now is looking at self-control and procrastination. And we're also looking at humility and self-compassion.
So,
It takes forever.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to hear it because in Florida State, we had a manipulation that would increase people's humility.
We fly from Belfast
No
to
manipulation.
China.
But here, you know, because in Florida State, there was no humility to
Yeah.
begin with, so the manipulation worked. But here, people are, they hear about humility every week more.
yeah.
And so
Well,
it's
that's
a
kinda difficult
bigger
to plan
issue, and
things
people are
out.
just, for one, they're
Yeah,
more
it's still,
humble,
the
and
return
another,
trip
it's
is still
just a
far
more,
enough out to
I mean, the
where.
Fulbright, they usually fund projects like
So
this,
they're
so
gonna
why
know how
would
to
they wait so late?
manipulate in a way that-
Well, so
Yeah, so
they have an
our
entire,
manipulation is still working,
so
but it's
my
not having as
thing has been
full
recommended
as
for
our control
funding.
group is
but there's an in-country review
No, that
process.
totally makes sense.
Oh, okay.
So that's
Where
where we
basically,
are with
like,
the, for the,
Either the U.S. embassy or the Chinese
Are you
embassy
having this
could
other
actually
way of doing
veto it.
yeah, we're
in a
actually
sense.
working with planetarium.
And so, like, that's just a long, probably
but I'm
even
also gonna be
politicized
trying
process.
Yeah. I mean, you were gonna get a teaching
run some
release no matter
studies
what
in
for a year
places that
with, if you get
one of my students, I
PDL and
think, is
then
going to be able to go to
the second
Stanford.
semester just because that's what
Well, so the PDL application basically is like, well, let's
We've been
see what
setting up
happens with
internship.
Fulbright, and then
We're
we'll
trying to do
resume
it
that
with a
discussion.
But I'm saying in our
Get them
department,
to be able to go places.
even if you do get PDL,
We want them to go
it's
places
been
where they want to
tradition
go to
to
grad
give
school.
the
because
professor
then
a
they'll
second
already
semester
have-
off.
Okay.
So that's what I would do if I didn't get the Fulbright.
That's what.
So what I propose now
To try and
is
get that work
the
done.
the 12-month at half salary, and the Fulbright would make up for the difference, right?
Oh, thank you.
But if Fulbright says
I would
no,
give you more, but.
then I would restructure my PDL proposal to say it's 6 months at full pay, and then the other 6 months from the
No,
department.
I'll make sure these
Right.
Okay.
get displayed.
And they'll get you a flyer or something.
Which, yes, that's what they did for Jim, that's what they did for Charles. I don't even know who the last person to go on leave before that was, but the last 2 chairs have gotten it, so there's a moral argument for it, right?
How would you get the impression BYU doesn't want to hire women?
Yeah. I asked her the same thing. I don't know if it was her experience as a student. It's not that they don't want to hire, but that she thought that it was.
Who doesn't want to hire?
It's not.
Are we talking about?
No, they're impressions by
Who's they?
certain women out there. There's another one that Cindy said, another one of our students said that she wouldn't be interested in coming here to work because she felt like it wasn't conducive to being a woman working.
Coming here to work like as faculty?
Which I find interesting. I mean, obviously I can't speak to that, being a man, not having experienced some of the things that certainly some women probably have experienced, right? But, yeah, I don't know.
I think it depends on the department. Like, I
That's
was
exactly
in
what I was saying, yeah. I mean,
faculty in the counseling center, and the men I worked with were great. I mean, I didn't even think
Yeah.
about gender
right.
issues at
Oh,
all.
good.
I mean, I look back and I can see some, I mean, I came from non-LDS context, and so I never grew up, I mean, I never thought about gender until more recently, and now I look back and I can think about some. I mean, it's a complicated issue,
Right, it
especially
is.
at BYU.
I have friends in the sciences, in that college, engineering. They're like desperate to try to, they were actively seeking.
Yeah, I wonder if it's
women.
We are too.
or something that's held on for 10 or 20 years. I mean,
It is true
For the
that
women,
like
you mean?
until very recently we didn't have like a reasonable parental leave policy. Like,
oh yeah.
I mean that's a genuine concern that like wasn't really, I think, fully addressed until
I
the
still
late
don't think it's
2000s.
sufficient for paternity.
And we don't have daycare because when I had my first child, I tried to stay, and I was offered 10 hours a week, and that would be perfect. You know, like I could be home full time and just come 10 hours, but there was no daycare, so I couldn't do that. And they don't have daycare because if you drop off kids, a lot of people are taking advantage of that, I guess. And I don't know. So I was offered to either stay full time or quit, and I just, I quit because I could have a home office for one evening a week and see the same number of, see less clients and,
Yeah.
and just keep my hand in it. So
Is there a reason we're still recording this?
I hope that's not being recorded.
I don't know.
Because like the initial idea was the first one, it was for people who couldn't be there, right? But aren't we all here?
We're all here. This is for posterity.
There were some from last year that were recorded, and I did watch them because I couldn't make it last
Yeah.
year because I was teaching at that time. So some people do watch them even if they're not here.
Well, so I'm uncomfortable with that actually. I don't know. Oh, I told you before that I was just like, I was poking around on YouTube. I was like, oh, let's see what's on the FHSS channel. And
Are they still?
lo and behold, the first
Still there?
meeting we had here was on the FHSS YouTube channel,
Right.
which, I don't know,
It should-
like
it
we
should be
weren't, I
down.
wasn't,
Right.
Oh,
That
yeah.
should have not been there, and it should be down by.
I haven't gone back to check, but I'm also like, if we're all here, should we just turn this stuff off? I don't know. Just throwing that out there.
I hadn't thought about it, honestly.
I'm not saying anything I wouldn't say in front of anybody else, either here or in public.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that, but then you're like, you're also not talking. I don't know. You implicitly change the way you frame things and what you're willing to share if this is like for an internet audience, right? And I feel like this is not that type of context, personally, but I'm charged.
Just tell them to ask them. Also ask them to take it off or make it private link.
Right. Yeah, well, I did ask for it to.
But
take
apparently
it down.
the old workshops are on
They're still
YouTube
there,
to
too.
watch.
Yeah.
Like, I guess I don't have a problem with like somebody going to the dean and saying, "Oh, hey, I know you have video from like last year's workshop. Can I watch that?" And that person being able to watch it if like whoever associate dean says so. But I'm not okay with like this all being broadcast on YouTube, which it was.
Yeah. No, that should be down. I asked for that to be taken down.
I'm live tweeting what you just said.
I'd actually be more comfortable with that than broadcasting everything I say on YouTube.
I can guarantee it will not go viral.
And if it does, it's in the very worst sense of that term.
Well, now we've had a chance to sit down, and finally that Rich has made it here. We were just waiting for you, Rich.
Oh, yeah, I knew
We've
that.
Just always
Yeah.
been waiting
Sorry.
for you. Anyway, so what we'll do is today is really your time, right? Your opportunity to. And in the past, we've had a lot more participants, so it's been very abbreviated, very limited amount of time. You have a little bit more time to work with today, but to just share with everyone the more specific things that you've decided to do, whether it's changes you've decided to make to your syllabus or to the structure of the class or content or process in the course or anything like that. We've had a variety of different kinds of presentations that have been made in the past. We've had some people who made PowerPoint presentations of the course that, you know, the lecture that they were going to give and things like that. So it's pretty wide open, but what we're just looking for is an opportunity for you to share with us what you've decided to do, what you've distilled from our previous conversations, and how that you're looking to have that play out in a practical manner. And if you've already been trying out some stuff in a class, a kind of a report back about what you tried out and how it played and so on and so forth. So I think if it's okay with you, Mike, we'll kind of start and go counterclockwise. No, yeah.
Well, Jake and I,
Clockwise. Yeah.
I asked him, you know, what format should this be in, and so I decided to print it out as my project, kind of in a very summarized form. So I decided to actually try something out in the class that I'm teaching right now, and I think of integrating the sacred and the secular content for my courses as being more of a slow process, and I can just try to slowly do this. So this has been...
Well, it is archaeology.
Well, yeah. We're looking at stuff from thousands of years ago. Anyway, so we, in this course, I definitely have a component that talks about archaeology of religion, which is also combined with symbolic archaeology, which is the identification of meaning in anything we find that's related to humans in the past. And so I kind of, put this out there as the learning outcome. What I really want students to be able to understand is how we take belief systems in the past and try to analyze them as archaeologists, and oftentimes as very secular archaeology, in a very secular way. But then also help people to put themselves in the shoes of people of other faiths, I think is another thing that I try to do with this component, or at least where I go beyond where I think I would if I was at a different institution, or if we didn't have the way it's set up here at BYU, where it is welcome to talk about our faith within the classroom. I use this class as a way to just basically teach people the value of diversity and how to see this archaeologically, I guess. So this specific topic, I would go through the definitions as I typically do in an intro course, right? It's very definition based, very much focused on teaching the methods associated with archaeology, but this one in particular had a couple definitions that I just put in there for your reference and how I teach it. We talk about the archaeology of cult. I try to make sure the students realize that this isn't a bad word, right? We often hear cult, and a lot of people take that as being a negative and having negative connotation. But in the definition that I provide, which is I think it's a very good definition of how we see cult in anthropology, and that in fact our faith can fit into that, and it's okay, right? So that's the first part of it that I've tried to incorporate, at least our belief system into this, and to try to get students to be less defensive when something like that gets brought up, when they get characterized anthropologically as a cult, not to be so offended by it. But then the second thing is I also introduce the four main components of religious ritual, and I give them the archaeological example of the earliest religious site known as Göbekli Tepe. It's a hard one to say. It's in Turkey. It dates back to around, I can't remember, somewhere around 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Close to where 11,000 years ago, so close to where it's pre-urban life, pre-civilization. So what's significant about it is that it appears that at least amongst these hunting and gathering groups, that religion formed before civilization and sedentism, where people were settling down, and the going idea had been before that basically, urbanization and domestication of food and all this stuff came first, and then religion formed. But in fact, we have a religious center associated with these people early on. And so that was how I typically taught it. And I said, let's look at why we would consider this place religious. They read a National Geographic article, which is really accessible to them about the site. And then we would apply these four main components of religious ritual and try to pick aspects of that site to identify it as a belief center, as a place where we could actually see religion manifest at this place. But instead, I decided to say, okay, let's pretend, and this is the activity that I did instead. You're an archaeologist 1,000 years from now, and I've done this in a kind of an ad hoc way before, but I made this really formal. I said, all right, let's pretend you're an archaeologist 1,000 years from now exploring the Utah landscape, right? And you discover what appears to be an LDS chapel. Now, of course, this is kind of a reverse process in that they are, most of them, if not all, are LDS, right? Are familiar with LDS beliefs and practices and know what an LDS chapel looks like. So it's a bit of a phenomenological approach in that they should be able to provide a lot more information on it. But they're taking a look at the LDS chapel in a very anthropological, a very secular way, right? To try to get at what is belief, what do these belief systems look like, and how do archaeologists actually make something of them. And so I say, all right, let's look at the artifacts and what they're associated with, but let's specifically look at the sacrament table, right? We might find small plastic cups, trays in which the cups fit, other open-faced trays, where we've discovered bread residue, right? So we have evidence of some kind of liquid, some kind of bread being in these containers. We have white sheets, of course, if there's good preservation, a large table with seats. And these seats actually face the rest of the seats that are out there that we expect a large group of people to be facing them, right? And then you have a microphone with wires that are linked to the communication system within the building. Again, thinking about it archaeologically, you've got printed prayers, right? Again, if they preserve, that say very specifically what may have happened at that table may have been projected through the microphone. And then other objects that might help them derive conclusions. And then I pose these questions, okay, so if you're an archaeologist, what might you be able to deduce archaeologically from these artifacts in their context, meaning where they were found? And when we talk about context, we're also talking about their association with other artifacts, their location within a building itself, whether it be intramural, like within a building, or outside, extramural. And then add to that their knowledge. So we kind of take a secular approach and then say, all right, let's add to that your knowledge of LDS beliefs, and let's talk about the symbolism specifically. And this is where, surprisingly, it opened up to a discussion of symbols that I think a lot of people either take for granted or don't think about a lot, right? Like the purity of the white sheets that are represented. You know, I don't sit there and often think like, oh, look, white sheets, I should be focused on the repentance process as being not only the culmination of my repentance process, but of this previous week, but also the beginning of a new week, right? And so we got into some kind of details of the sacrament that I didn't expect to come out that related that was very deep-seated in their own belief system.
Symbolism, the other dimension would be their burial cloths.
Yeah.
Would be the what?
That they're burial cloths.
If in fact there was a burial found with them, right? So, but we.
The sacrament is a burial.
Oh yeah.
Ceremony.
Its relation, you mean specifically to
Death,
Christ's
resurrection,
atonement, resurrection? Yeah. We talked. I mean, they started talking about how the table itself is elevated above the group of people. Again, some symbolism I haven't really thought about, but obviously that's. I think that is intentional, right? And then we relate this back to the four main components of religious ritual. We say, okay, what we find in this LDS chapel, do we in fact see that it's focusing attention on that activity? Obviously being in front of the room, being elevated, and then having a microphone that projects to the rest of the chapel definitely makes them focus on that activity. There's a boundary zone, right? This occurs within the building. The microphone system doesn't extend to the outside. There's walls and doors that can be closed to the building itself, if of course these were preserved. Presence of the deity, sometimes symbolized by material image or form. Of course, if we could relate it back to the atonement itself, it's symbolized in the bread and the water. And that's also mentioned in the prayer, right? So if you have evidence of the prayer. And then finally, participation in offering. Obviously, in this case, eating and drinking is representative of participation in that offering. So it gives them, of course, a very internal perspective of what ritual is, as we define it, but using our own faith. And it panned out really good. And of course, the thing I was most impressed about was how much symbolism they were just really squeezing out of the whole process that I personally don't often think about, just because sacraments, I'm usually trying to keep my kids from being loud, or other things that we often commonly are doing during sacrament that don't relate to the ritual itself. And it was great to see the students kind of take that and not only realize that we analyze things in what may be kind of an odd way, non-religious, but to see the religiosity in it, and as a believing archaeologist, I think is something that we need to do more of, right? I think there's a real need for believers in these disciplines, and it is a good example of how I showed them that not only am I an archaeologist, but I'm also a member. I think there's some professors on campus you could go through a whole semester and not even know that whether or not they were a member of the church or not, right? I mean, you really could do that. So this, I think, made it more real for them.
I try and do a lot of this, and my students still think I'm not LDS.
Well, what else are you teaching them? You're not walking with a coffee cup, are you?
Does that so has that distinction become fairly clear to them, like how this is distinct from, say, a more purely secular approach to the archaeology of religion?
Yeah, definitely.
Does
I
that
think
come out to them?
I definitely, as because another part of the discussion, especially when we talk about the archaeology of cult, is the manifestation or the belief in the supernatural, right? And so when we talk about Jesus in the classroom, that just becomes super clear that obviously this is an aspect of that's particular to an LDS example.
But
is that your question?
I guess what I'm asking is, does it become clear to them that the reigning assumptions in naturalistic archaeology don't allow you to see some of this stuff the way that you're talking about seeing them?
I'll answer that with an emphatic I don't know. I think that would be a good follow-up question. That'd be a really good follow-up question to be very directed and said, okay, do you now see the difference? So, yeah. No, I can't say that I do because I never asked him.
Yeah, that's
That'd be a great
I had that
question to
same
incorporate.
question that Jacob had, was teasing that out.
I can make it more overt, I guess. And believe me, I chose low-hanging fruit. I mean, religion, archaeology of religion, obviously the easiest place to insert our own religion. But I thought it was natural, and for the students it was. It was really easy for them to transition to see this, right? To see the
Because I
connection.
do an analogous thing in my introduction to cultural anthropology course where we talk about the anthropology of religion, and I've become more bold about it, I think, in the subsequent iterations of the course. And I, end up throwing up this question on a slide that is something to the effect of, can you be a social scientist who studies religion and still actually believe in anything? And that's a thought-provoking question for them. And we talk about how a lot of social science, even at this very university, it's actually hard to actually answer that question in the affirmative, looking at the way the social science of religion is typically done, where it's being reduced to something other than the thing that it's ostensibly about.
It's funny you say that because if I had time, I was going to flip the phrase archaeology of religion to be the religion of archaeology, and then pose that question.
Yeah.
So how do you guys view what we've talked about so far in this class, but in light of what we just talked about in religion, is it okay?
Yeah.
Can you do this? So,
I was
but we
looking
never
at
got
your
there, so.
I was looking at your last question here. How do your interpretations and knowledge of these symbols help identify what happened in this room as it relates to the four main components of religious ritual? And I was looking at it, I was thinking it might be fun too to play with that question a little bit and say, to draw out the difference of an approach to the archaeology of religion that proceeds from a naturalistic perspective versus one that takes religious experience seriously, to say, now, how do your interpretations and knowledge of these symbols help identify what happened in this room if you don't think anything other than behavior happened in this room? Or if you believe something sacred actually took place, that people really were reconciled with the living Christ in and through these rituals.
That's
how it
great,
changes. Are these things merely symbolic or profoundly symbolic?
Right. Okay. No, that's great. Great suggestion. Definitely can go there.
And I mean, in the quest for concern with diversity as well, there is to say, now, if we're looking at the LDS chapel, of course, we're going to be looking at this and saying, well, yeah, definitely some reconciliation with the Creator happened here. But what if this is a non-Christian LDS site? What about what took place there? Or is,
So in this case, it works really well with the majority. But obviously, we have non-member students in the classroom. So my question is this too: how appropriate? I mean, how do you Because I want to say, all right, how many of you are LDS and how many are not LDS? I don't feel like that's appropriate in the classroom to single out somebody who may feel like that is a way of pinpointing them as non-LDS and possibly, them interpreting that as, oh, I'm not LDS, so he's going to treat me differently, right?
You can ask it in a less
That's what I'm wondering.
invasive way.
Because that would help me not assume that everybody knows.
Want to comment on this?
Because obviously, if somebody is an LDS, has never participated in a sacrament meeting, they will be at a loss on this activity. So I don't want to miss out on those people. So is there a way to check even beforehand, like on lists?
I always put,
Can you do that?
I have them answer I have them write on a sheet, their
Oh,
grade,
okay.
their class, their religion, if they served a mission. And I don't think they think anything of it, but it's private, so
It's at the
no one
beginning of
else.
class?
I do on the first hour,
day.
the
Okay.
first
That's
10
good.
minutes of class, and then I go home and check and make sure.
Okay.
And then I speak differently depending on the constitution
That's
of my class.
great. That's great. Because I think
So-
that's not confrontational, but
It doesn't
definitely is
embarrass
more,
them
and
or-
it's private.
yeah.
It's more private, so that they don't feel like they're projecting to the class.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's in the
Come to me
service
with a
of,
Mormon and
I want to be more
convert me.
sensitive to you as my students.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
In
That's
service of
and that's why I do it.
Okay,
And-
great. That's awesome.
I have
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have only giant classes,
Mm-hmm.
and so I always assume, and there always are people who are not members
Great.
of the church in there. So I kind of, and because I have not always been a member of church, it's more easy for me. It's easier for me
Okay.
to be able to say, okay, or if you were in a Catholic mass and you found a Catholic church,
Oh,
what
okay.
kind of things you were. So I just sort of.
I mean,
broaden
obviously, I
it.
can mention the Eucharist as being a very similar process, although that being said, there is the belief that it actually physically changes the
Right.
bread or
But that's
the
something
wafer to
that you
flesh,
could be
right?
bringing up
Yeah.
and have them discuss
Okay.
the differences. I think that would.
I've done it anonymously in big classes with the clickers. I do
Oh, yeah.
business mode, and I do this sort of a collective getting to know you where I have them click in these types of things so that everybody can see the distribution.
Oh, that's
but
great.
RULDS is one of those,
Excellent.
but it's it's also.
But it's
Yeah, that's-
anonymous, right? So in the same way that you do. Well, it's not anonymous in that case because they put their name, right?
Yeah. It's
But I
only
could do
to
it
me.
without a name,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I could say, don't put your name. I just want to get to know
Yeah.
what the class is like, and I could just say, general, answer these questions. Okay.
Yeah.
Just as a follow-up, I think, once you wrung the juice out of your example, just change it slightly. It's okay, now it's a Catholic cathedral. That gives you the opportunity
Yeah.
not only to deal with Ed's question is, we can't be confident that there wasn't salvific
Yeah.
stuff going on there either, and then just play up. But the real point is, if the question is, what is this stuff I dug up? You have two metaphysically different answers for the believer, for the theistic point of view and the non-theistic point of view. So this is not a trivial question.
Right.
It is an absolutely crucial question,
Right.
and that's just a good setting in which to make that point.
For me, where that would come out is this exercise seems to be an interpretive, kind of descriptive, but anthropology does more than that. It gives explanations.
Yeah.
And that's where it would probably come out a little more, the naturalistic presumptions of anthropology.
and there were other
Why
follow-up
did
questions I had.
Why did they have all these why do we see all these artifacts at this particular time? And then you're going to get more in a naturalistic account, and that will help you see that the question of what is going on is often linked to the stories we have to tell about why it's going on. And so the naturalistic anthropology will reduce what the what is to something.
And I think the why
that's
as well.
there. And yeah.
Right.
Well, what you learn is you can't separate those two questions.
Yeah.
because the
You
why and the
can't
what
separate.
are
It's great.
intrinsically
So,
bound.
yeah.
Yeah. These are definitely some directions I can easily take the conversation.
Yeah.
And I will say that even though these are the three questions I put here, these are only starter questions because
Yeah.
it did evolve into a discussion, a religious discussion that was very much based on what do you take away from sacrament? I mean, that was the cool thing about it that I didn't expect for it, or way where I didn't expect for it to go, and it was great. It was really good.
I
Like
think
people
too-
were talking about the organ and the music beforehand and how it helps them get into a mood. All the layers of symbolism in just that one.
Well,
thing
I
that we do
think
every
too,
Sunday.
just to encourage a kind of empathy there to say, okay, so since we're looking at this LDS chapel and what takes place there as Latter-day Saints, and we're understanding how much is there now. Wouldn't you you would want an archaeologist to be sensitive and looking at all of this for what it means to you. Now, you as an archaeologist may be looking at religious artifacts and sites for other religions. How ought you then empathically approach that?
Yeah. I could even follow up with the Göbekli Tepe example of its earliest form of religion and say, okay, now, discussing all this stuff, how can we actually look at this as people who really did believe what they believed? And how can we be more empathetic?
Because I think sometimes we get into that mindset of, they had a false religion, or they were just play acting, or primitive animisms or whatnot, and so we can end up dismissing and even using a naturalistic way of approaching everything, except ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
Except us,
Exactly.
right? But
Which just gives an opportunity to open it up to say, we can be believers in archaeologists, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's really cool. I'm glad that you had a fruitful discussion.
I don't feel like I incorporated a ton,
But still,
at least took a swing. And
take a swing and see how it goes.
It went well.
I have to say, as I've integrated into my 101 class, it's really, as a topic of sustained discussion throughout the semester, it was initially maybe one session, and now it's almost like one of the major sub-themes of the course.
At least every other lecture?
No, it's more so that it comes up very early, because as soon as you start talking about cultural relativism with a bunch of with 500 Mormon kids in a room, questions immediately arise, right? And so it sort of comes up early, and I sort of hit it. But basically, I guess all I'm saying is that every subsequent semester, it's become much more focused and sustained, and it's a lot more fun,
More natural.
yeah. Indeed, in the best sense.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
Naturalistic.
Not naturalistic, just natural.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. Evan?
I should have asked this before. Does the podium there work without a laptop, or do I need it?
You know what? I think
It does have a
requires-
computer. Do you have a USB or something?
Okay, great. I just need to.
Have a little computer.
You have a USB or something?
I'm getting it off my learning suite.
I know there's one that 10 through
I can plug in if you don't have, I have my laptop.
It has a
Yeah. I don't think I will use it as much as my big phone number reasons, but it's really helped me come up with some things to add to my
First two papers.
So 101 is intro to anthropology and 110 is.
One of the things is
It's a GD course.
she doesn't do the involved.
So right now, like of course I'm teaching this semester just because of the time and everything. About 63, 65.
I don't think so.
That started at 65. We always get a couple.
Yeah,
Is it
I
a
think
G?
so.
Social science.
And,
Social science, but we just got it
I
approved for
think it's
global
one thing for
enforcement
students to
awareness
sort
as
of tell
well.
the difference between
So I
naturalism,
can only get
theism,
so 101 right now fills
theism
those two, and they
from a
garner
different
anywhere from 600
doctrine,
to
then I think it's confusing to them. I don't want
And
to
of course they have the
confuse what
rooms and stuff. So
the
yeah,
actual really integrates.
Yeah, the students I sent you from my class.
Jason's been doing it.
wanted to
Working
talk
with the professor right now.
There were
For me,
at least
kinda like
double
the-
that.
So we could go that route, but
They
I've
have to
heard
present
scheduling
another
rooms is
religious
such a
text.
nightmare.
And
He'll
you'll-
probably
Terrible
Yeah.
draw.
That's not so
3 to 4
hard.
sections a semester.
So
Yeah.
I almost have to undo.
You want to use
So
his
it's not big
laptop?
sections,
So-
but
Yeah, that would be
So I
great.
think I'd
Can
rather
he use your
start
laptop?
Yeah.
without it
Right now,
and
he's
getting
this. But she gives me a lot of
Learning
stuff. That's
suite.
I imagine we'll fill it up once people realize they
Yeah,
can
that's perfect.
get, knock out 2 GEs with one.
I guess we'd have to wait for him.
That's my hope too.
Yeah, integrate.
Yeah.
Show that we're serving the community.
Another sandwich or another brownie?
You know what?
These are smaller, this is obviously better.
They're interested in cultural diversity.
I
didn't have breakfast. I'm gonna have another
Very easy to address. Anthropology or archaeology class.
I think our multicultural American class is always maxed out because
It was interesting when I
get their GE and get talking about
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the funny thing was though is that
Yeah.
I had to submit it twice. The first time,
But you have the freedom to
it's,
do it here, which is
Yes.
I realized that I hadn't convinced them that archaeology, like dead people, have culture.
How are you?
And it was like, okay, so you're talking about people that have passed away, even though we do historical
wanna sit down
archaeology,
on
which
your-
is the recent
Yes.
past. which
How's your
includes our ancestors.
integration
Right.
of Christian
But it was
schools?
almost like they were
It's gonna come
people live differently
this month camp,
Oh.
so we're gonna need a mirror.
valuable for
Or
us.
that these descendants and
Are you
the
putting all that
history of
online?
these
Are you
religions that we
having them
live
present,
there,
or-
these cultures that live
He
there,
will
have
present,
something to do with
that'll
their
be
history.
online, we'll also invite some
It was the weirdest
You're
thing
welcome.
when I got comments
Oh,
back.
I'd love to hear it.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be
It's
great.
almost like they were looking for stuff to nitpick, and then the logic was really just
Want to get
Wait a
people
second.
who are interested in it.
They were judging
around
us
an
more on
informal
like,
conversation.
oh, these
Because
there's 2 different professors teaching
we
this
sort of work
course,
at
but they're taught differently.
Other schools,
Where-
if they've got this down.
But they
don't.
said in their documents,
That's
it's
really
okay if you
interesting.
teach it differently as long as the basic
So,
kind of
we can be
concepts are
a
taught, which
center
they
of
were.
gravity.
Sometimes those GE
Yeah.
things.
The forum where they can come in and work it
I think it's more of a
once-
numbers thing.
I once
Some individual,
applied,
some individuals that are way down the road from us.
Well, that's
It was
a
GE, we applied for a
realized
second
a lot of
GE
classes
in archaeology, and
through
they
the
were
divinity
giving all these
school.
illogical.
Pastoral
It
counseling.
ultimately got approved, right?
To me, were
Yeah, it
better
did. That's the
therapists.
funny thing. I
was
changed
being
almost
trained to be.
nothing, submitted it
We were
again,
taking a
and it
completely
got
secular
approved.
approach.
So
So
I was new to a reviewer who thought it was
Yeah.
worthy.
much deeper stuff was going on there.
All right, I'm ready
So-
to
We have a mini set up for that here.
Yeah.
discuss my class. I don't print syllabi out anymore. I just use Learning Suite, and I really have 2 primary objectives with my project is to have the methods component of the class open up to a discussion of the theistic and naturalistic approaches to history. And then I'm also interested in counterbalance. I guess I'll get to this in a minute. Let me discuss these readings that I've had. I think on the first day of class, I'm going to, in addition to assigning a couple of readings from McNeil and Stearns that talk about why study history, I'm going to also have students read the Alexander Morrison piece that opens up a discussion of the theistic presence in history, and students in their discussion will be able to take that into account. In my History 200 class, the main project that they're doing is writing a research paper, 10 to 12 page research paper, which for us might not seem like too much, but for them it's, for some can be a challenge. But the other written component I have in my class are lecture logs. And a lecture log doesn't have anything to do with class lectures. I'm using the Latin meaning of that word to mean their readings, and I have them choose 2 excerpts from each of the readings and then discuss why those are relevant to the questions that I've posed for them during that week. And so for the first week, their lecture log would include responses to those readings. What we typically do is have a discussion based on their reading, and then when I would hand those back, I also comment on several of the responses that perhaps weren't brought up in the class discussion. And that's a way to, I do that anonymously as well. It's a way to bring in first students that aren't apt to speak up in class, and then also to bring to light responses that might be more thought-provoking. As you can tell, the class has a lot of very practical components. We go to the library, to special collections, and an idea that I came away with from our last session was to integrate a theistic approach to these actual components. So previously, when we talked about evidence and primary sources, we were simply looking at the documents as they would be used and interpreted, the questions that would be asked to understand and interpret would have been completely naturalistic. In this case, from the same book and I think conference that was held at BYU as Elder Morrison's piece, the introductory lecture called The Sacred and the Secular opens up interpretation to a theistic approach. So what would an interpretation of these documents look like if we allow for a theistic approach to our interpretation? And I think what's interesting is that you have in this class, you have family historians as well as what we just call the mainstream history majors. And this, I think this can open up avenues for students writing their papers. And I guess they could take this into account, whatever topic they're writing on, but it might be kind of interesting to see if anyone wanted to write their paper employing a theistic approach to the evidence. And this is interesting because I was thinking in the mode of, well, maybe the family historians, if they're writing about family, but actually you could, any student, if they wanted to experiment and try that, could incorporate that in their final paper. I think that would be very, very interesting. It's probably an approach that, unless they were doing family history, they probably wouldn't continue on through grad school with. I don't know what you all would think about that, but I think it would be very hard to get something published. I don't know, maybe I'm naive about that.
There's a, I think it was one of the books that I had Richard forward to you by Jay Green, Christian Historiography, and I'm just about finished with that. Found it incredibly insightful on that very thing, because he addresses that. You know, that's a concern about how do you go about producing quality work that's recognized as quality work, given the naturalistic presuppositions of the discipline, and how you wrestle with that, what do you do and go about it. And there are a number of chapters in that book that just looking at the syllabus, I'm thinking, particularly in terms of what you just said about maybe encouraging students to try their hand at that they could get their bearings from some of the things that Green writes about in there. How do you pull that off? How do you make sense of that, right?
Richard. Slightly different line of thinking here, and I don't know that much about history, but back to, I think it was Stan's point, does the theism, naturalism distinction come into play in both method and then explanation? I mean, the methods of getting the documents and evaluating them is one thing, but then somebody's got to put that all together And I'm assuming that those kinds of assumptions would work at each level, but probably not in the same way.
Right.
So it's at that level of the writing of history, the practice.
Yes, the
That's
interpretation.
where that really would come into play, and they're so closely bound. The gathering of sources, their evaluation, and the explanation. They're going to inform each other. Maybe in your discipline, and probably about the same in anthropology, a little less so in psychology and sociology, maybe, because we've got data. But I think to be conscious of that at every level, that's your great challenge and your great opportunity.
Right, because they have to interpret the sources themselves, and then putting it into the paper is a whole nother level of interpretation.
And I found with this whole question, years ago I formulated the question, what difference would what difference would the restoration make in what you do? I mean, we often ask ourselves as members of the church, if you're accused of being a Mormon, is there enough evidence to convict? How many decisions in a typical week ever took account of your commitment, your Christian commitment, your Latter-day Saint commitment? And the same is true now. Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. And that's the art of it and the challenge of it, it seems to me. But I think you're
So I
on the
can
right
probably
track.
extend that on down to the written paper itself. I think I've had a couple of students do that of their own choice. In fact, they were some of the best students, and so they may have already incorporated that into their way of looking and interpreting history. I don't know how this fits in with the sacred and the secular, but it might be my commitment to inductive research. And Richard talked with me a little bit about this. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around phenomenology and as an uncovering. And one thing I'd like to do with my students is help them think through the implications of approaching research from an ideological perspective, where you begin with assumptions and carry those through your research, looking to see if it fits that particular lens, or what I prefer is a more inductive, and I think which most historians do, letting the evidence guide your research. And I haven't used this in a class, but I think this was a courageous book written 5 years ago, obviously by someone who is a full professor and has some freedom now to write what they really believe. It's called The Undivided Past, Humanity Beyond Our Differences. And I need to teach ideological approaches because that's what my profession demands of me. But I also want students to have the freedom and possibly and this isn't disparaging taking an ideological approach, but the honesty to let the research lead where the evidence points them. And I'm concerned about the nature of dialogue in the academy and the role that divisiveness plays. And Canadine writes, whether envisaged individually or collectively, the reality of the human past has always been informed by dialogue, interaction, connection, borrowing, blending, and assimilation, at least as much as it has been by disagreement, hostility, belligerence, conflict, separation, or unlikeness. That our sense of the past and of the present has been too often dominated by an exaggerated insistence on the importance of confrontation, and difference is not only a disservice to the cause of knowledge, but also misrepresents the nature of the human condition and misidentifies the best paths by which that condition has been improved and may be further improved. And so I guess you could attribute this or have this point towards greater civility, but I think for me it goes beyond that as well, in letting, not that you're writing history of consensus, but realizing there are other ways of researching and writing beyond an ideological perspective. And when we talk about argumentation, it doesn't relate directly, but I think persuasion plays a big part in the art of argumentation. And Corey Leonard gave a devotional several years ago that looks at this from his perspective in international relations, but I think would be useful in helping students recognize first that there's an audience that they're writing for, and that persuasion is as much a part of that as hitting them over the head with a certain perspective that dominates the interpretation of the analysis. I'm going to continue to have them. This was what I had limited my discussion of the gospel in class to: zeal without knowledge, and Sean Miller, who was the chair of the history department, gave a devotional about questions and the importance of asking the right questions, not just in life, but in our intellectual pursuits. Finally, we do talk about the current state of the discipline, the subfields that students can ascribe themselves to as they're doing their work. But something that's becoming increasingly important to me is understanding the evolution of historical philosophy and the worldview as espoused by important historians and philosophers over time. And I don't know if I'll have students read these entries themselves or if I'll integrate this into the lectures. But, I find the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to be a very, very helpful resource because it, in some cases, gives what to me is very important, a little biographical overview of the individuals, which I think is important to understanding interpretation, as well as their influence on historical philosophy. And this is something I've already done in breaking these two lectures up, is I'd like to have a day where we have a discussion about those historical philosophers that incorporate a theistic point of view in their conception of how the world has moved forward. And so I don't like St. Augustine to just be a starting point that the students don't think matters because he's antiquated and been superseded by subsequent philosophies of history, but to look at his perspective. Giambattista Vico, who was an Italian scholar at the early part of the later stages of the Enlightenment, and then Johann Gottfried von Herder in the later on in the late 18th and 19th centuries. The following lecture, I'd have them read Marx and Foucault, and I'm not going to be leading them towards any conclusions, but looking at a more materialist and then postmodern perspective, I think gives them a healthy variety of different approaches to historical philosophy, which really boils down to, it's what Richard would call historiography, but the way that the world as it is has unfolded, events in history, how they influence each other causally. And then where this comes down in an assignment, they have the lecture logs, but their final exam, in addition to the paper, they also have to take a final. Usually that's been an afterthought, honestly, because getting them to the end of the paper is their primary task. But this would all come back in the final in terms of assessing how well they can articulate the naturalist perspective versus a theistic approach. And I could ask, because I've often assigned method books and asked them to comment once their paper's done how it influenced their writing of their paper. And a question on the final exam could be, how has a theistic approach influenced the writing of your paper this semester based on the readings that we've done? Primarily my project is getting me to open up the discipline to a theistic approach, whereas formerly it largely had been done through a naturalist's eyes. And I feel really satisfied that this is going to do what some of you have mentioned. Students is what Elder Holland has said about teaching the gospel to children. I think students are hungry for this. And I might have been underestimating them to this point, because exposing them to these ideas more than anything else, I think will help them to uncover answers for themselves. And I think that's what's more important than me leading them to any conclusions that I might personally find most satisfying.
I like how in the development of the discipline of history, you have, in the course of having them look at 5 different thinkers, you have Augustine is clearly a theist, and then we get Vico and Herder, which are much more humanistic, but clearly it's a humanistic kind of naturalism. And then with Marx, and even with Foucault, it's not humanistic, but it's clearly naturalistic nonetheless. It's to be able to not only just, I like what you were saying, is having the students read that and not read it in a kind of progressive sense, but here are 3 major positions and different flavors of those positions that are still very much alive and relevant to what we're doing here as historians, how we think about what is the play of history, and how has the discipline developed to articulate the play of history.
And what causes it to move forward? I took this from an article that Richard has written that he's working on publishing right now. And in many cases, the idea is, well, it's just, it moves itself that way. The causation creates itself, but what happens if we allow for God in the history of philosophy? What does that mean for agency and our role in it?
Michael Medved,
I do know him.
The Divine Providence. Have you ever encountered his book on the history of the United States? And I had it recommended to me, and I was a little nervous to read it, so I got it as an Audible. I listened to it on Audible.
Is this just the most recent one that just came out with? This is the full one?
It's pretty new. It's only like a year old.
Oh, okay.
And so I was like, oh man, Michael Medved is a film critic, a Christian film critic. But I listened to his book. He reads his own book. It's actually good on Audible, by the way. But I was actually really surprised at how even-handed it was, and how he was kind of, hey, look, not everyone's going to agree with this interpretation, but let's look at what happened. And his basic framing, the book is about how did we ever get the United States to have the kind of territory and the kind of composition that it has today. And his angle is to always emphasize, he kind of emphasizes contingency. And so what I'll try to do is always go to these points where you can see all these contingencies operating in historical moments. And then he basically kind of raises that both the people involved at the time, and we can see, looking at it in this more broader contextual thing, we go, wow, appealing to divine providence makes sense. I mean, it just kind of makes some sense. And he would point to things that I was like, I've never even known. You know, you're like, in a naturalistic history, they don't even pay attention to these kinds of things. I mean, just
Or if
the
they
battle,
do, it's...
the Battle of New Orleans, or, just all these different things that were so relevant to how things unfold. So, I mean, this is, it's harder to find good examples. I was a little nervous, well, is it going to be rigorous enough? Or is it just, because I've read other Christian historical biographers, and I'm just kind of like, man, I feel like I'm getting pushed this interpretation on.
Yes, right.
And, but anyway, that's kind of the thing that I don't know, I would be curious to see how real American U.S. history people react to his book. But
Prett's article actually addresses that. He looks at the restoration, but then he looks at how does this play out, say, in the history of the United States. Contingency is very interesting because from a naturalistic perspective, I don't know.
You always have to account for it in a particular way.
Right.
We're not going to allow it to remain open.
I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the clock.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's not your fault. I'm supposed to be more attentive, but I get caught up in what you're doing. So
I'm sorry I took so much time.
I'm sorry.
I'll tell him after.
Afterwards is fine. I want to make sure that Curtis and Diane have plenty of time as well.
Mine won't be too lengthy.
I'm not good at monitoring the clock because I get swept up in what you're talking about.
So mine's a little bit high level in that I still have there's some open-endedness in terms of what specific assignments that I would do, and I could think of these as, reflections or sort of class discussions or something else. But what I wanted to do was kind of show you where the class was, and then where I saw places where the kind of stuff we've been talking about might be able to be realized more fully in a way that they haven't been. I'm sensitive to comments over the last couple weeks that we don't want this to be sort of a single activity. We want this to be a theme that sort of works through the class. But I had to think to myself in very specific terms, like where would this show up? How would this manifest itself in the class? So this is to give you a sense of how the class has worked so far. Basically, I have 3 major sections. And in the first, I just try to get students who have known nothing other than kind of modern capitalist life. I try to get them to see that this is a kind of unique moment in history, and there's other ways that people have lived, and give them some accounts of what it looks like to live in other societies, what it feels like. And then we walk through the mainstream and behavioral economics and economic sociology. And I have this kind of thing on ethics that's always been really interesting to me, but I've never figured out how to incorporate it. So I had some readings, and it always fit oddly in this section. And I think this workshop has actually maybe helped me think about how to incorporate that. So I'll come back to that in a minute. And then we have a research project. And the project that we're working on now, this is a capstone course. The project we're working on now is a study of multi-level marketing. So if you think Nu Skin, doTERRA, stuff like that, we're sort of living the mecca of multi-level marketing and using that as a window to understand intimate relationships, family, friendships, and how they can become commercialized and what are the consequences of that. So that's the way the class is. And what I want to show you is how I've changed it. So how I'm thinking about changing. I'm teaching in the spring, so this was timely for me to sit down and try to make some adjustments. Okay, so the first thing I thought of was introducing a couple topics here, which would say, well, we have all these different systems that societies use to produce and allocate How would we evaluate them through a naturalistic perspective? And then, and it really sort of inspired by this class thinking, having the students think more critically, but also holistically, and say, well, if God matters in the world, how might we evaluate these different types of systems? And that would lead to a discussion that would look something like, allow us to say, to have conversations, is there a system that works best for a world in which God lives? And maybe, and I want to be open-ended about this, because I think students are very kind of resistant to feeling like they're being, that I'm pushing them to say capitalism isn't good or capitalism is the best. But I want to say, if capitalism is this system that sort of, then what does it look like, the capitalism we have now? Would it look like something different? Asking pointed questions, thinking about Zion.
I love that question.
Would Zion have markets? And so, Abby, and there is no answer to these things, right? But to have them reflect on it, and then we can look at some of these different attempts to have different historical examples of people trying to grapple with what alternatives to our kind of modern capitalist world would look like. And so, and some of the readings I've been thinking about along, and these lines, Hugh Nibley has some stuff Stan mentioned that I wasn't familiar with. Philip Bryson, who was here when I was a student, and he was in the economics department, and he has a BYU studies. I remember he gave a devotional when I was here as a student, so this was 20 years ago. He gave a talk on the sort of virtue of competition and markets, and he's got a BYU studies paper that sort of walks through the profits and makes this great defense of markets, and capitalism is sort of like the sort of right and true way. And so I think pitting some of those against each other.
Bryson?
What's that?
Who was that?
Yeah, Phil Bryson. Yeah, I think using he may have been.
Because that was actually kind of one of my questions I have for you. Is how do you do this without letting students not do the thinking for themselves, right? Because there's plenty of stuff that says, well, I've heard, a general authority tell me that, communism is not the same as a united order.
No, and that's right.
How do you get them?
Yeah, and I want them. So what I have in mind, and again, I don't have the specific activities planned out, but being able to come with people that the authors' points of view that the students might trust. So having people come from different perspectives and saying, okay, how do we adjudicate between President Benson having a real problem with communism, and then you have these sort of experiments in Brigham Young's time with these united orders. Although they're not exactly the same, but having them think critically, what's not exactly the same about them? Why would one be endorsed and another not be endorsed? Yeah.
Did Stan give you specific readings from Nibley?
No, he mentioned it.
I'd recommend you look at Approaching Zion.
That was the book I was thinking of. So I haven't.
Because one thing to help students think about this framework of them finding out for themselves is, I love how he makes the argument that sometimes the two opposing ways, neither of them are right. And that there might be a third way in the binaries that we'll present.
Yeah, that's great.
Or tension between the two, living in that tension.
And that neither of them are the...
Yeah, and I would love have a reflection, a short reflection where they work on something on their own and come back to class and say, hey, what would this look like in a way that isn't just sort of, if we look at the naturalist perspective, we're saying what's efficient, what sort of maximizes wealth and opportunity for the most people, but that might not be the way that a caring God, if there was one, would think about things, and having them come up with some ideas. So
a caring God who wants us to care like Him.
And wants us to flourish in more ways than economically.
How does naturalistic assumption of egoism, utilitarianism, how does that fit with a world in which there's a caring God who wants us to care like He does, right?
Yeah, and that
it brings into bright relief, I think, a question about that kind of unquestioned value of efficiency.
Yeah.
Or maximization of wealth, or maximization of opportunities, things like that. That'd be fun to help students, to not give them the answer to that, but to invite them to sit in there and think about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, the the good part, the good thing is I don't know that there is any answer.
Right.
So it's not. It wouldn't be easy for me to say, I figured out the system, and this is the way the order of heaven works, right? And so, but to get them thinking about it.
Start your own movement.
I will, and I'll say that you inspired me. Okay, so this was how I was doing this section on how markets work, and what I wanted to kind of building on what conversation we had last week, and I'll just quickly go through these last couple of slides. Really examining the assumptions that all these sort of different views are based on, right? So mainstream economics people are determined by their needs and wants, and behavioral people are predictably irrational, and sociology is always concerned with how people are shaped by their social context. And then say, how does this square with a theistic view, and be able to have a conversation about that, and maybe these inform our theistic view, and maybe our theism informs some of this, but to be able to have a conversation, which we haven't done. We've done a little bit, but it's been ad hoc, so I want to make sure to do that. And then this will be the last thing I'll show. This is the new section that I thought of that kind of helped. And so the idea here is to say, hey, if God mattered in the world, we wouldn't just want to know how they work, which is the focus of the last unit, but what they do to us. When I say what they do to us, I mean what kind of people do they make of us? And what happens to institutions. But I'll probably pick one of these and sort of do a case study and say, hey, what happens to the university when it becomes commercialized, and how does that change things? And so, and the good thing about this is there are secular writings that deal with this a little bit, right? And so this isn't entirely a foray into sort of
And actually links well with sociology's critique of economics.
That's right, and I think that, and so anyway, so that's basically. I don't want to steal the rest of the time, but these are the sections I had before. I modified these ones and thinking of this new section here, and see how it goes.
Makes me want to take the class.
Me too.
Yeah, take the
You know, what would
Professor
excite me
Donovan.
is that, I might get 20 more years of being with Curtis. But this is like a lifetime of thinking about this, right? I mean, you're going to retire and still be thinking about
Yeah,
these
no, that's
things.
and I like classes that are like that. That
Yeah.
it feels like there's these are issues that aren't going away quickly, right? So.
That's great.
Thanks, Curtis.
Curtis, will you log me out?
Oh, yep. I'll do it over here so she can. Are you using the computer so you can get set up?
Did you send in my little sense of
I
community?
did, and I haven't read it.
Okay, don't
Sorry,
worry,
thank you. Yeah,
I think that, I mean, it's not totally related, but
No,
I'll
that's
give you
great.
some
Yeah,
thoughts.
no, I've got it on my
Okay.
to-do list.
So I've been teaching for 30 years, and then I just got the job here a few semesters ago. So what my big plan was when I got here was to take all of my lectures and rewrite them and include doctrinal and spiritual aspects to it. And so what I really did was I looked at a lot of the places where psychological research supported or was supported by doctrine and spiritual issues and things like that. So every single lecture I try to make sure that it had plenty of that. And so for instance, when we give a lecture on emotions, I talk about all the research showing embodiment of emotion, so that we really only experience a full experience of emotions through our bodies. And if at any point we can't feel our bodies anymore because of paralysis or anything else, then we have a very limited and stunted experience of emotion. So what does that tell us about why we chose to come to Earth? And why would we want a body? Well, because we can better understand emotions if we can have the full experience. So anyway, it was that kind of thing. So I did that for every lecture. I tried to go through and put in a lot of content. And the very first thing I do the first day of class, well, the very first thing is I go over and say, this is what these are the tests we're going to have, and so on. But then I end the first day of class by sharing my testimony and my conversion story. I spend like 20 minutes telling them why I converted to this church. And it's a difficult thing to do because it's a very emotional story. It involves the death of my daughter. And it's especially hard to do like 2 times in a row in 2 classes. But I think that it's important to set the tone that we are going to talk about these issues in class. So right from day one, we start talking about it. And what I wanted to get out of this group of meetings was I was hoping to get lots more content ideas to add to all my slides. So I wanted to have even more, Elder Cook clips that I could put up to say, okay, this is what Elder Cook said about self-control. And so I'm going to add that to my lecture on self-control. And I did get a lot of that, and so I thank my mentors very much for that kind of material. But what I also got was that that's not enough. It's not enough just to say that this is how psychology supports my beliefs, and this is how my beliefs support what we're finding. That we really need to question the worldviews that we come in with, and that's what I got out of this that I didn't have coming in. I did get what I wanted to have coming out, getting the more content. But so my second lecture always was on methods. And in psychology, no matter what class you teach, the second lecture is almost always on methods. The first chapter of every textbook.
What class is this that you're doing?
This is social psychology right here. But I'm going to probably use a lot of this in my intro psych class as well. So I have a lecture that was called Methods, and I go through all kinds of stuff about, scientific theories, overview of scientific methods, the different kind of research designs, experiments, field experiments, longitudinal research, sort of go all through all this. But what meta-analysis, sorry, it's taking longer than I thought. Okay, I think we're almost to the end. But what I wanted to add to this was now to start getting them to look at the assumptions underlying our understanding of the field and talk about the difference between naturalism and theism and deism, and what does it mean for our understanding of the world if we believe that God created the world and continues to intervene? And how does that affect our belief in science? Well, science is based on replicability. And that's both its strength and its weakness, because a strength is we know that it's a real finding if everybody can keep replicating it over and over again. But if we believe that there are things that are miracles or other interventions of God, those may not be replicable, but that doesn't mean they're not real. And so so I try to talk about, or I will try, I haven't done this yet, it'll be next semester, but we'll talk about what are the made assumptions, as well as the advantages and disadvantages of both kinds of approaches. So what can't science tell us? Well, science requires that replication. If I go into the sacred grove, am I going to see 2 angels like Joseph Smith did? No. Even when Joseph Smith goes back into the same grove, it's not going to happen again. So we don't have replicability. So there's nothing that science can inform us about that kind of experience that is not just a real experience, but that profoundly influenced the lives of millions of people. So it has a reality that cannot be denied, but it also can't be replicated in the way science would want us to. So anyway, I just sort of go through that, looking at also how theism might help and what are the what kinds of things would be a problem from a theistic viewpoint, what kind of things would be a problem from a naturalistic viewpoint. And so I kind of come back to where I started with, looking about how theism and science can inform each other. But now I think it's from a much, not just broader, but also deeper perspective than I was doing before, where I was just looking at content. And I think, well, that was just sort of ways I can integrate them, kind of things that we can do. And talking about creation specifically, I took a lot of stuff from a book that Ed recommended that was called Social Psychology and Christian Perspective. I like it a lot. I probably won't use it as the book in my class because it's from a different Christian perspective than ours are, than we have. And so she has a very different view of original sin and the fall. And I think giving other doctrine is more confusing than not giving doctrine at all. So I'd rather kind of start with a total naturalistic book and then pull in what I want from her work, rather than trying to start with her work and say, well, no, we don't believe that, but this is how we would. So anyway, that's where I've got a lot of this information from, and we'll talk about, in general, how the theistic view can inform us about things that science can't, in addition to backing each other up in various places. I think, anyway, there's a few more slides, but that's the general idea. So
I think just introducing it in terms, it's just a wonderful way to invite a conversation in the class, right? Really good questions, but they're also the way you framed some of the things you had there. Their questions were, okay, you're in my class. Here, what are you thinking about this?
that's what I don't want to tell them what to think. But I take this class, I just switched it around this semester so that we spend a half an hour every week in discussion groups of 10, because it's a huge class. It's over 100 people. My other class is over 200. So the discussions we have in class, usually a few kids talk a lot.
Right.
So I break them into groups of 10 and try and make sure that everybody has a chance to have this. And up until now, for example, the book that I'm using, it has every single chapter. It says, so what does this tell us about human nature? And in our discussion groups, we take that and say, and what does this tell us about our divine nature? But what I'd like to do in the discussion groups now is also say what we learned from a naturalistic perspective, how can we interpret the same information through a theistic perspective? In the discussion groups where everybody has a chance to contribute, not in the lecture where I'm telling you what this is, but that I want to pull from them rather than push the information on them.
Does it come out in the discussion that I think one of the really valuable insights that students get from this discussion is realizing that this is not the normal modus operandi in psychology, that most psychologists are unwilling to do this. And by the way, once you do this, you realize that naturalism is a religion. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
Like, I think making sure that they sort of get to that point of realizing that naturalism itself is like a framework amongst
Make sure they
frameworks.
realize that, yeah, okay.
That and then
Suggesting to Mike that the cult of naturalism
Yeah.
that we're all here participating in
That's right, yeah.
is now looking at the cult of this ancient religion.
I don't know. Once I guess in my experience, once they realize how avant-garde of a discussion this is, they actually almost get even more emotionally invested in it.
Yeah,
Because
I'm
it's like,
hoping
wow,
so.
I don't want to be sucked into that. Like, I want to eat the red pill. Like, wake up from and sort of realize that wait, naturalism isn't the only game in town and whatnot. Like, I don't know, that it gets them much more, I guess, emotionally invested in taking it seriously and remembering it and so on.
That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I like the way, no matter how the students end up
Blue pill.
answering these questions or wrestling with them together or in their own minds or whatnot, they cannot help but come out of your class knowing that you take this issue seriously.
I hope so.
Right.
Yeah.
That this is important, this is a serious matter. I like that they have the freedom to go wherever the question leads them, but that the questions were validated as worth talking about is really important, I think.
When I first came to the very first of these meetings, we started talking about theism versus naturalism. I was still thinking, yeah, but I want more content. So I have to say thank you very much for opening up my mind that this is the more important question than just adding more content. That I was like agreeing, yeah, that's important, but what I really want is more content, and I have come to a 180-degree about face thinking that this is now what I really want to do, is change their way of thinking instead of just giving them more things to think about.
I just have one question and a thought, and I love what you've done, and I think it's really highly distinguished where you were and where you come to. Have you gotten any feedback on sharing your conversion story with the students?
Yeah.
Positive?
Yeah.
Have you ever had anything negative? I'm just curious. If that's
Nothing
gone well.
negative. I have had people say that one girl came to and told me, she said, I wasn't going to go on a mission. I had already made my decision. But after I heard the conversion story, I put in my mission papers. And I've heard many, literally dozens of students have come and told me how it really affected them. Some students have told me that my class informed their religious thinking more than the religion classes that they're taking. But I think it's probably because of starting with that, opening myself up that way, that they then are more willing to share things about themselves as well.
I think that's great. And I mean, I think it's also making me think, just curious about the feedback, just because I've done it before at the end and left more room for them to project onto me, and I can't decide which is better, because I can see it's gone really well to do it up front.
Yeah, it doesn't mean there's no student who hasn't
Yeah.
thought bad thoughts about it, but no one's come and said anything. I've only gotten positive feedback.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that doesn't mean that some people didn't like it.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an ongoing kind of thing that we struggle with here in trying to integrate the gospel is, how do you leave room for that student who's not all the way faithful, so that they can kind of slowly come on board with thinking through that naturalism is a religion, and that there are different ways to think about things and different worldviews, and even within a theistic perspective, there's different amounts of depth. And so how do we leave room for them to be able to explore that, and at the same time lead out with the foundation we're already standing on, I think, and you're leading out with that, and I think that's not threatening. They're here for that reason.
The best thing is if more classes took this. So if they take my class and they take Evan's class and they take some in all different areas, and they're sort of getting these different viewpoints that we're not teaching the same thing, so that will give them the option to kind of move. Well, I kind of liked what he was saying more than what she was saying, but it's reinforcing altogether. So that would be my guess.
Yeah, I
The
think
more,
that's a good point.
so I think, and I want to say, I'm kind of the last speaker, so I want to say thank you for organizing this, and to all of those of you who mentored and put your time in, because this has really been transformative, and I really am very grateful for the experience, the opportunity to partake in of this. Thank you. Thank you.
I would have to echo it. I mean, I love doing this because every year I come in and end up learning from faculty who are participating in it. I realized long ago that I'm not an expert, right? But you guys teach me the way you think about things, and it's just a lot of fun to explore the ideas together, and it reaffirms my faith that we got a lot of great faculty at this university who really care first and foremost about their students and the gospel as much as their disciplines, and so it's been wonderfully edifying for me as well. I'm sure I can speak for all of the other workshop members. I hope that you've found it beneficial, and that in whatever particular way you end up going about this in your own courses, that you find it affirmative and that and helpful. So again, thank you for sticking with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.